Welcome to Pop Culture Retro, which was recently voted the 15th best podcast by the residents of the Golden Years Retirement Community in Boca Raton, Florida. Each show, we'll revisit some of your favorite pop culture memories with insider and outsider perspectives. Now, please help me welcome your hosts, Ike Eisenmann and Jonathan Rosen.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of Pop Culture Retro. I'm one of your hosts, Jonathan Rosen, along with Ike Eisenmann, and today we are thrilled to welcome the musical director of the legendary Glenn Miller Orchestra, which is celebrating its 80th anniversary, Erik Stabnau. Erik, thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, we have a lot to cover, but to start with, you grew up in New York. Did you come from a musical family?
To some extent, yeah. My father played the saxophone when he was growing up, and my brother also played the saxophone, my older brother. So it felt like a natural thing for me to play the saxophone. So I grew up playing music and playing in bands and things like that. Yeah, so a musical family to a certain extent, yes.
Well, about what age did you start developing an ability to play?
Yeah, I started playing the saxophone around 10 years old, and then I got interested in jazz music and big band music in my grade school years. You know, like a lot of younger musicians, I played in the jazz band in middle school and high school. So I knew about this era of music, and I knew the name Glenn Miller growing up, of course. But I went on to study music in college as well, which is where I really sort of worked on this music a bit more.
But you were aware as a kid, you were aware of the big bands and all that? Was that played in the house, or you just took an interest in it as a kid?
Yeah, my parents liked that era of music as well. So I would hear that stuff around the house. And I think for anyone that's played in like a jazz band in grade school, they've probably come across In the Mood and A String of Pearls and Moonlight Serenade and some Glenn Miller songs like that. So, there was some familiarity there. Yeah.
When did you first become aware of Glenn Miller himself? I mean, that orchestra.
Yeah, I think I knew the name, but to tell you the truth, I wasn't really aware of just the history of the music and who Glenn Miller was as a musician and all that stuff really until I joined the orchestra, which was 2017. So I was familiar with the big hits and I knew the name Glenn Miller growing up, an in-depth look at the history of this music and this era of music and all that.
Well, how did you come to the Glenn Miller Orchestra?
Yeah, I mentioned I joined in 2017, June of 2017. And I had a friend in the orchestra at that point. He was a trombone player that I knew from college. So he let me know about a position in the band that was opening up for a tenor saxophone player. And I sent in my audition materials. And a couple of weeks later is when I got a call from the tour manager that the position was mine if I was interested. And a couple of weeks after that is when I joined the band. So I had a friend that let me know about it, and I auditioned, and in a short time afterwards, I was touring.
Wow. Before we go on with questions about you, so the Glenn Miller Orchestra has been around now like 80 years. I mean, so can you give us a little bit of its history and how it got started?
Yeah, absolutely. It's really kind of a fascinating story. You're right, because 80 years ago is when Glenn formed his group. It was March of 1938. He started his famous band, and he'd been a member of other big bands before that, and even had an attempt to start his own band before that. But March 1938 is kind of what we think of as when Glenn formed what we now know as the Glenn Miller Orchestra. And so he led his band from the late 1930s into the mid 1940s, and that's when he had this huge success and a lot of number one hits and top 10 hits. So he's probably the most famous band leader during that point, at least during certain points in his career. And some folks may know the story. Glenn was lost during World War II. He was a member of the Army Air Forces, and his plane went down over the English Channel in 1944. But after his disappearance, the Glenn Miller Orchestra, it went on touring in one form or another for a while, for about a decade. And then we cite 1956 as like the official kind of reformation of the Glenn Miller Orchestra in its full-time capacity. And the band's been touring nonstop ever since. There was a
Oh,
couple years off the road for COVID. Um, but really it's been nonstop ever since then. And the band is as busy now as ever. The band's playing in some years like 200 or more shows in that
oh
year.
my gosh.
So really it's been going almost nonstop since Glenn formed it, and the band has stayed just about as busy that whole time.
Well, this might seem like a silly question, but because it has such a legendary name attached to it, when you first came into the orchestra, were you required to learn its history, or did you just do that on your own?
Yeah, I think it's sort of just a byproduct of being in the orchestra. I think you know, you play this music every day, and you're just going to naturally learn about the music and some of the history. I think for certain members of the band, and certainly myself as music director, there's more of a goal to sort of dive into some of the history and really learn about this stuff. And we're lucky to have a lot of different resources to become familiar with the music and the history. There's a home office for the Glen Miller Orchestra in Orlando, Florida, and they've got scores and music that go all the way back to the 1930s. So that's a fabulous resource. And there's musicians that have toured with the band for over 20 years. Those musicians are a fantastic resource. And we've met some historians around the country as well, folks that operate various Glen Miller archives and things like that. So there's a lot of different sources to kind of learn the history of this stuff. And it really is a fascinating one.
I just want to go back a second. You mentioned talking about the Glenn Miller disappearing the plane. So what was the official explanation for that? And what do they think happened?
Yeah, there's some mystery surrounding it because his plane went down over the English Channel and it was never recovered officially. They never found
Mhm.
wreckage or anything. So I believe Glenn Miller was listed as missing for quite some time. It may have been well over a year after his plane went down. And you know, over the years, various theories have arose about what happened to Glenn, and maybe even kind of conspiracy theory type things. I think the accepted understanding now is that it was just bad weather. You know, in a plane built in that era wasn't capable of handling that sort of thing. It's a bit of a treacherous journey across the English Channel. So I think the accepted theory is probably the plane went down in a storm and the wreckage was never found. But that was big news, of course. You know, here's Glenn, maybe
Oh,
the most famous musician in the whole country, and he went missing during that time period.
what were the conspiracy theories? I don't even know if I read any conspiracy theories for that.
Um, some folks think that he may have been hit by a bomb. His plane may have been hit by a bomb, or that I don't know that he ended up somewhere other than the English Channel. So you know, if you look into that, you'll see a lot of different things. But I think yeah, the generally accepted idea is the plane probably just went down in bad weather.
Well, you said, like you said, the body was never recovered. So where can people go pay their respects to their official memorial, Glenn Miller?
I believe there's something in the UK. I believe there's a memorial there in the UK for Glenn. There's a lot of places around the US that kind of pay tribute to Glenn in their own way. In Clarinda, Iowa, small town in Iowa, there's the Glenn Miller Birthplace Society and Museum. That's where Glenn was born. This little town, we play a festival there every year for a couple days over the summer. The official Glenn Miller Archive is in Boulder, Colorado, at Colorado University, and that's where Glenn went to college for a couple of years in Boulder. So there's a huge archive there with all sorts of memorabilia and things from that
Oh, great.
era of music. There's a couple different places around the country uh, and elsewhere that have sort of their own tribute to Glenn Miller in that regard.
How long did it take, going back to you now, how long did it take you to go from, you joined the orchestra, you said, until you became the musical director? I mean, is that something that they asked you to do, or did you have to audition for that?
Yeah, I was asked about it over during this time off during the pandemic. You know, that was a time when there was a lot of change and turnover in the band, especially in personnel. So I was approached during that time, and as the band started touring again in a full-time capacity, is kind of when I stepped in front of the group as musical director. So I had been just the tenor saxophonist in the band up
Mm.
until that point, several years, and then the pandemic was kind of when there was a bit of a transition.
Well,
Well, what are some of the responsibilities that come with being the musical director?
Yeah, so at the shows, I'm kind of the host of the show, the MC, if you will. I still play tenor saxophone in the group and I sing with the group. But I'll kind of host the show for the audience and speak a little bit between each song about the history of the original band and the music and the musicians, as well as introduce the musicians that we have on stage and maybe tell a few stories or anecdotes here and there. So that's kind of my responsibility at the shows. And then otherwise, there's just kind of a lot of organizational requirements, organizational things that you might expect. So I'll make the set lists or I'll prepare music for the band. Um, the orchestra really doesn't rehearse all that much. We play so many shows we don't have to, but we'll rehearse occasionally at the sound checks, those sorts of things.
well, so I grew up in a household where my dad listened to Glenn Miller a lot, as well a lot of the music from the big band era. So I became a fan because of that. So he's had so many famous fans as well. I was reading about them, like Sinatra, Louis Armstrong, etc. Surprisingly, I read that he has a lot of detractors as well. So what do you think that is? Where did that come from? Was it just like a jealousy aspect?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, maybe so. I guess when any musician or celebrity reaches a certain level of fame, I suppose you're going to have, people that love them and maybe people that can take them or leave them. I think nowadays we just see a lot of really positive reactions to the music. It's such great music from a significant time in the country's history, the onset of World War II and all that. It's really just nice to see a lot of positivity around the music and a lot of nostalgia around the music these days.
Well, does the estate like the Jimmy Stewart biography film, or feel it was accurate?
Yeah, I think the film it's not necessarily 100% accurate, but I think it certainly did a lot to increase or renew popularity in Glenn Miller when it came out in the 1950s, and I think it portrays the story in a hopeful and positive light. So I meet a lot of people that was their introduction to this music was the Glen Miller story and all that. So it's really kind of a beloved movie and I think well liked.
Hmm.
It's such an icon. The orchestra is such a well-known name. It's iconic in American history. So when you go on tour, now this is I'm very curious. You have to stick to the original arrangements because of that, or do you have some leeway to do some variations?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the goal of the orchestra is to kind of sound like the original band from the 1930s and 40s. And there's differences, of course, between that era of music and the way musicians played then, and the instruments and the pieces they played versus what we have nowadays. So there are some inherent differences, but I think the goal is to sound like the original band. So a lot of the arrangements that we're playing are identical or as close as possible to what Glenn would have played back in the 1930s and 40s, and we'll update it for the band to play nowadays, to play, maybe for the first time the audience has heard this music in 80 years. Now, with that being said, we also like to feature the personality of the band as it is nowadays with our current musicians. So big band music and swing music is an improvisational kind of music. There's a lot of solos. So we let the musicians kind of show their personality in those solos and with that improvisation. But the goal overall is for folks to come to these shows and kind of feel like they're back in a time machine and hearing the band as they have back in the 30s and 40s.
Well, on that point, because it is such a well-known brand, do the fans get upset if you do vary from the originals very much?
I think a lot of folks may not necessarily recognize small differences here and there,
Uh-huh.
but there are a lot of really knowledgeable fans about this music, and I think a lot of folks would know the difference. So I wouldn't say necessarily they care as much one way or another, but we do hear from the fans sometimes like they want to hear certain accommodate when we can. But it really is a knowledgeable fan base about this music.
Hmm.
Well, speaking of the fans, I have another question there. Now, do you find what's the general age of the fans? Is it usually tend skew older, or do you find all ages coming?
Yeah, it definitely skews a little bit older. I think at one point, people coming to Glenn Miller Orchestra shows would have been members of the greatest generation that may have heard Glenn Miller or grown up with Glenn Miller. Nowadays, we have a lot of the children of the greatest generation. So these are folks that wouldn't have necessarily grown up hearing Glenn Miller live, but they grew up with that music in the house because their parents liked it. So it's very nostalgic. But we get a pretty good mix at the shows too of young and old. I think especially at events and dances, there's been like a bit of a swing dance revival from the 90s and on.
Yeah.
And I think younger folks really like that sort of swing dancing and vintage culture and interest in the 1930s and 40s. So there's a pretty good mix overall.
Swing dance did become huge again. I remember when it started happening. So, going back to Leeway, so I'm curious, do you have to check in with the Glen Miller estate before you decide to do anything, or did they give you the freedom to like do anything that you want on their own?
Yeah, there's I've mentioned the office of the Glenn Miller Orchestra, which kind of owns and operates the Glenn Miller Orchestra as we tour. So whatever we do on the road, we'll check in with the office, but we kind of have the license to do things freely or as we want to, as far as these shows are concerned, kind of perform the music that we want to perform and perform it how we want to perform it. But the goal is always just to be kind of authentic to the original band.
But you won't get a call saying, "Hey, why did you do that?" this, this time.
I haven't yet gotten a call like that. We'll see. Hopefully.
Well, what are some of your favorite venues and places to perform?
The variety is really great because I mentioned all those shows that we play. So in a year, the band's going to play big theaters, small theaters, and everything in between. And we play some events as well. They may be in, and it's really nice to have some variety. So coast, and within about a week, we played a symphony hall in Seattle called Benaroya Hall, where Seattle Symphony plays. It's this huge, ornate theater, and it's so fun to play in a big space like that because it feels unique, and there's a huge crowd there, and the acoustics are very particular for a room like that. So the big rooms like that are fantastic. And within that same week, we played a jazz club in Oakland called Yoshi's, which is probably about a 200 capacity. So it's 10 times the difference between those two rooms. And that was equally as fun because it's such an intimate space, and the audience is sitting as close to the band as we're sitting to each other. You could practically reach out and touch some audience members. So that's a very intimate and interactive and lively setting as well. So I'd have to say any variety is fun with the orchestra, but especially the big halls and the real small clubs are kind of fun to play.
Mm.
You just did a whole album with Crystal Gayle to commemorate the 80th anniversary. How did that come about?
Yeah, the album, you're right, is to commemorate the 80th anniversary of, I suppose, 1944. And that was a period when Glenn was serving in the military. He was in the Army Air Forces, and he led a military band as well. So he's playing all this popular music during the war era. And it wasn't just your typical big band, but it featured a string section as well. So the goal of this album was to record some of this music that hadn't really been performed since the mid 1940s with the big band and with a string section. So it's very exciting music and a very exciting album. And then later on in the process, we were lucky enough to have Crystal Gayle join the orchestra for one song, which is actually not a Glenn Miller song. It's called Sentimental Journey, which featured Doris Day singing for Les Brown's band. But it seems like kind of the perfect fit, a very nostalgic song and a great vocal feature for Crystal.
Well, what was she like to work with?
She actually came on a bit later in the process after the Glenn Miller Orchestra had been in the studio. So the production team, the producers, got in touch with Crystal. So we did not work with her in person, but it's exciting to have her.
Oh, wow.
A little bit later in the process.
You mentioned Doris Day. Now, did you use the same arrangements as were originally used with Doris Day?
Yeah, it's just about the exact same arrangement, her kind of classic, famous version of Sentimental Journey. Yep.
Hmm.
Wow.
Well, what are some of the other things you're doing for the 80th anniversary?
We're kind of just on tour this year, as always. Playing a bunch of shows. So this album coming out was kind of the goal for this year. It was released just recently, within the last couple of weeks, I believe. So we'll just kind of be on tour, and we'll play a lot of the music from this album. We won't be with the string section, for these shows, but there's a lot of these that we can perform with the big band personnel that we tour with. There are certain events that will kind of celebrate this music. I mentioned Florinda, Iowa, and the Glen Miller Birthplace Society and the festival that they have every year. That's in June. So that's a nice opportunity for the band to perform for a lot of really knowledgeable and excited fans. So for that show in particular, or shows similar to that, we will dive into the history of this music and play some things from 1944 that maybe haven't been performed since that year. So there's opportunities here and there
Wow.
to kind of celebrate that year in music. And otherwise, we'll just kind of be on tour as always.
But what do you see as the legacy of the Glenn Miller and of Glenn Miller himself and the orchestra?
Yeah, I think on one hand, here's maybe the most popular musician of the 30s and 40s of the swing era. So just that alone is a huge legacy. Um, but I think even more than that, it's also very significant music at a very significant time in the country's history. We've touched on World War II, and this
Mhm.
music will always be associated with the war era and sort of the soundtrack of the war era. So it's important music, and I think it's hopeful music and fun and lighthearted music. So I'm glad that the orchestra is not only around 80 years later, but that people still know this music and are excited about hearing it live. And that's kind of our goal, is just to keep playing this stuff as long as people want to hear it.
Hmm. Do you ever stop and just think that that you're now the face of a legendary orchestra, and so what does that mean to you to be the one to carry on that legacy?
Yeah, it's really something, and it's an opportunity that I certainly don't take for granted, and something that I'm very grateful for. When I joined this band in 2017, I wouldn't necessarily have imagined myself. It really is something special to have the tour the country and have a chance to perform every night. So I certainly don't take that for granted.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Well, what are you working on next?
Well, we've got a little bit of time off right now. We had a show yesterday in Chicago, Illinois, and we're getting on the road again toward the end of this month. So usually we'll be on tour for a couple months at a time. Then we get a couple weeks off, then a couple more months, then a couple weeks off. So really, we're just going to keep at it, keep touring. We're celebrating this album that was just released, and that's kind of just a typical year for the Glen Miller Orchestra, just almost on tour nonstop.
I'm just curious now. You mentioned Crystal Gale there. Do other famous singers like join in like at certain stops to come on with the band?
It's not usually. We've done shows in the past with other bands, other legacy or tribute bands of this era, like Fistra that's still around, or with other bands of that era that are still around. Um, at one point, we would do a show side by side with the Diamonds, if you're familiar with that group, back in the day, the vocal group. And having Crystal Gale on this album is incredible. So it's not a common thing for us, but there are certain opportunities here and there to do that sort of thing.
Oh, fantastic. Well, how can people follow you and the Glenn Miller Orchestra on social media?
Yeah, there's a couple social media accounts. I usually direct people to start with our website, glenmillerorchestra.com, and that's got kind of all the information about the band, and it's got our tour schedule. It also has a little marketplace on there where you can find this new album and others. And of course, there's links on the website to our Facebook and Instagram pages. Our Facebook page is called the world famous Glen Miller Orchestra, and our Instagram handle is at the Glen Miller Orchestra. So if you follow those, there's just a lot of fun pictures and videos from day-to-day life at the shows and on the tour bus and everything in between. So it's a kind of fun behind the scenes behind the scenes way to see the band and meet the band members.
That's good. Well, Erik, I want to thank you so much for coming on. I'm a big Glenn Miller fan. Like I said, I grew up with the music, and I urge people to go there. It's such an iconic American, set of music, really is, and I'm glad that the legacy is being kept on.
I appreciate that. Yeah, it's fabulous music, so we're just glad people still know this stuff.
Well, again, thank you for coming on today. Again, this has been Pop Culture Retro. I'm Jonathan Rosen with Ike Eisenmann, and again, a very special thanks to Erik Stabnau from the Glenn Miller Orchestra. And please like, comment, and subscribe.
Thank you for listening to Pop Culture Retro, where no one was hurt during the making of this podcast.